Greetings, this is Richard Rhoda, and this interview is part of the Tennessee Board of Regents Oral History Project. It is October 2nd, 2018, and I'm pleased to have with me now Dr. Kenyatta Lovett. Welcome.
Thank you.
Dr. Lovett currently is the Executive Director of Complete Tennessee. He's the charter Executive Director. And we'll ask him in his own words to describe Complete Tennessee, but it's a new approach, it's a new element of higher education, not just in Tennessee, but nationally as an intermediary, a nonprofit advocacy, community engagement-oriented organization. We need to talk about that. Prior to joining Complete Tennessee, or starting it, Dr. Lovett was a member of the Board of Regents staff at a time when the Board of Regents was going through transition, part of a reorganization and new legislation called the Complete College Tennessee Act of 2010, and we'll talk about that. And prior to that, in higher education, Dr. Lovett was on the staff of Volunteer State Community College in Gallatin, Tennessee, where he had a number of tasks which dealt with external relations, as well as, I guess, chief of staff for the president of the college. So great different aspects of a career path in higher education. So, Dr. Lovett, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Right. So first, how did I do on your introduction? Did I hit and a little bit before you came into higher education, what your background was?
Yeah, you did a great introduction. My background, I mentioned to you a little earlier, I was born on a college campus, Eureka College in Illinois. My father was a faculty member, and my early days from birth to around 4 years old was on a college campus in faculty housing in Illinois. And we transitioned into Nashville. He was a professor at Tennessee State University. I mention all of that because my entire life has been centered around higher education in one way or another. After graduating from college, I spent time in the private sector for about 10 or 11 years, and eventually found myself back in Nashville and working on what I thought to be a project at Volunteer State Community College, but the minute I landed on campus, it felt just like home. I remember being around faculty members and administrators and staff members, and it's just been great to be back in higher ed and also make a good contribution for the state.
Well, very good. And I meant to ask you earlier, but who was the president of Volunteer State when you joined them?
The president was Warren Nichols, Dr. Warren Nichols. He had just been on board for about a year. I think he had joined a year prior to me coming there. Hal Raymer, however, was emeritus. He was the emeritus president, and our offices were, believe it or not, right next to each other. And so when Dr. Raymer would come into the office from time to time, we'd share stories about, and he knew my father from TSU, and we'd talk about things that happened in the state from his time, because he definitely is one of the pioneers of Tennessee's higher education system. So it was a great way of getting up to speed and starting in higher ed by really having conversations with Dr. Raymer.
Right. So, and that's a good point to make, because the link to this series about the oral history of the Board of Regents, Hal Raymer was the founding president of Volunteer State, but before that was on the staff of the State Department of Education that was involved when these colleges were formed. And he was, you've alluded to this, a walking encyclopedia of how all that came about. And just, he was a type of president that we don't quite see now. How would you characterize him as a president?
Yeah, Dr. Raymer's style, I believe he had education from Ohio State and a pretty prestigious background. Definitely his knowledge of the policymakers. He had great connections with policymakers at the state level and possibly even the federal level. We didn't go into that much more about the state level. In terms of his leadership style, he really cultivated a lot of leadership from individuals and gave them a lot of free rein to do the things that were needed to be done. He had an interesting perspective on community colleges that's foreign today than it was then. His belief in fundraising for community colleges. He believed that the state should supply the resources necessary for a community college to function. So when it came to fundraising and aggressive fundraising, as we see now for community college presidents, that wasn't necessarily something that he believed that community colleges should be focused on. So that core mission, I mean, he was there right at the ground level of the core mission of community colleges really nationwide, but especially for Tennessee. He committed to that being a open access, almost not really a low cost, but definitely the barriers to access were considerably lower at the community college so that you could better serve students and better serve the community. And his reach went well across the state, and anytime you mention Hal Raymer, everyone just lights up because he's helped so many professionals out there to get their start, and a lot of college presidents can claim their fame to be having worked with Hal Raymer.
Yeah, well said. And he was just truly a gentle man.
Yes, he was.
Very good. So my first question then, when you wore various hats at Volunteer State, your transition to the Board of Regents, and did that predate the Complete College Tennessee Act, or was it right around? What were the circumstances?
I started in 2004, and it's interesting you mentioned the Complete College Tennessee Act of 2010. So coming from the private sector, I was really used to outcomes, used to some type of metrics to measure how an organization is doing. So for the first 6 years, it was questions I had in my mind around, well, how are students getting out and how are they doing? And what about these strategies and how do we use technology to improve our work? And ironically, my start at Vol State was to build up their website. And there were faculty members in 2004 that thought the internet was a fad. So it was interesting to try to bring in technology to help the institution sort of upgrade their skills and their assets as an organization. But I started out prior to the Complete College Tennessee Act, really being kind of not finding where I really fit in the whole higher education framework until the CCTA was launched.
Right. So we probably ought to compare notes how to describe the CCTA. It was landmark legislation as far as Tennessee higher education was concerned, and it basically talked about legislative changes in the way higher education would be funded, in the way institutions would look at themselves and how they would look at their missions, and then under that were a number of policy provisions, and this would you want to talk about some of those about what kind of program and policy changes, particularly for the community colleges.
Yes, and the interesting thing about the CCTA is for the first time, to my knowledge, the community colleges had a lot more emphasis or elevation from the state level. I think the thought was if we're going to improve college going rates and college completion rates, we have to improve our community colleges. And then because of that, there was more specific language for community colleges within the CCTA than you may see for the TCATs or at the time they were tech centers, or even for our four-year institutions. Things in Section 8 is the one that always sticks with me because I was responsible for it at the Board of Regents, but it really centered around building this community college system as opposed to the previous way where there were independently operated community colleges that may or may not have partnerships across the state, and then also the student experience from one community college to the next would look totally different. One would think that wouldn't matter because if you go to one community college, that should be your only experience at a community college. But all 13, I'm sure, would say that students progress and transition between different institutions all the time. So Nashville State and Vol State, there was a lot of back and forth. Columbia State saw the same thing with Nashville State and probably even Motlow State. So I thought that was a really important piece of creating this system, and it's a little guidance on how you can actually do that.
Yeah, so a little bit of clarification. So at the time that the Complete College Tennessee Act of 2010 came to be, there was this is my take, so reality check, an undercurrent of thinking maybe there's going to be a governance change. There would be, instead of what ultimately happened, that the universities would be separated from the community colleges or how that would work. And Phil Bredesen was governor at the time, and if I remember correctly, what he was saying was that's not the point here. The point is, as you said, to get more students in and successfully out, complete. And there's not going to be a governance change, not the creation of a new board, but within the Board of Regents, the community colleges are to be organized in such a way to be more cohesive. Was that the term?
Yes.
Whatever. So it was, one way of looking at it, there was a structure within a structure. Maybe that's the way to look at it. But it did put more focus on consistency and coherence among the institutions.
Right, from the internal inner workings of the systems to also on the academic side, articulation. The Tennessee transfer pathways was embedded in that as well, so that required our community colleges to think in different ways of how they partner with their four institutions.
Yeah, could you elaborate on that, on the pathways?
Sure, the Tennessee transfer pathways are a framework by which the state would make sure that any student taking general education courses at the community college level, based on an identified list of career tracks or majors, that if they took those courses basically from that prescribed list of courses in that track, then when they transitioned or transferred to a university, that all those courses would count towards their bachelor's degree, which essentially eliminated a lot of issues around individuals believing, and part of it was true in some levels, that not all community college courses would transfer. And that was sort of a rhetoric that was around the state. This way, you could clearly say, if you take these prescribed courses in this particular program or major, no matter where you go across the state at a university, they will accept these credits. And what was even more great about this program, the private institutions also adopted this. So it wasn't just an MTSU or an Austin P, it was also a Lipscomb or a Belmont that would accept the credits as well.
Right. And to a point you made, so courses that were not designed to transfer were clearly identified.
Yes.
Correct. So they took some of the uncertainty, or students who would take courses with every expectation that they could go on to a university would know on the front end there's certain career-oriented courses that were not built to transfer.
Yeah, and it's important to know with the CCTA, that's been part of the work with the completion agendas. I would say in the enrollment mindset, it was okay for a student to wander around in an institution before they found their way and earned a degree. Now with a more push around getting them out in a timely manner, you change your mindset as an institution to think about how do we limit the pathways to make sure a student doesn't get off track and waste a lot of credit hours trying to figure out what they want to do or earn that degree. But more importantly now with financial aid also at the federal level being more stringent, we realized that we were hurting a lot of students because as they were figuring out what they wanted to do by changing majors all the time or taking the wrong courses, they may eventually run out of aid before earning that credential. So a lot of things came together for CCTA that were helpful overall for the student, but a lot of that has to do too with the federal push around completion as well.
Right. How would you characterize well, it was heavy lifting for you and others on the board staff to, put together a plan on how to implement, but not everybody thought this was the best thing. There was some pushback. How would you characterize that?
Yeah, the most interesting ones for me being on the inside, a community college system within the Tennessee Board of Regents system, as you said, a system within the system. What does that look like? How do you organizationally manage that? That was a big challenge for the system office. I think the other thing that was really interesting around creating this comprehensive community college system is convincing 13 institutions that you have to do things alike. Each individual community college believed we were doing the right thing by our community and we know the best way to do it. Rarely had they been brought together to examine what's really the best way to do it and can this be replicated across the 13. So within the system office, there was a lot of challenges in terms of how does a community college system fit within TBR, but then even in this comprehensive system, it was a challenge for institutions to figure out, I know these are our peer institutions, but do we really have to adopt practices that are not necessarily native to our own institution?
Right. So it was clear that the community colleges, that the CCTA did impact all institutions because there were, again, a word about the funding formula. The idea was to turn funding at right angles and align the funding mechanism with the outcomes we were looking for. So instead of saying we want more students to succeed and complete and earn degrees, but still funding institutions based on head count, was a disconnect. So that was one thing where the funding formula was shifted to reinforce policy. It was a policy tool, I guess. And the same thing with master plans being where there's a clear understanding that institutional master plans had to be under the umbrella of THEC. So there are other things involved, but your particular area is community colleges. So moving forward, and this is going to take a jump in time and chronology, but the next big change for the Board of Regents, as well as all of Tennessee higher education, I guess, was the Focus Act just a couple of years ago, 2016. And if you, from a board staff perspective, how was that unfolding, and what was the thinking at the time?
Sure. Internally, the universities are sort of the heavyweights within the system. We have to back up and think culturally what that means to have universities versus community and technical colleges. From the perspective internally, there are a lot of individuals, both at the region level, at the governance structure, but also with staff members and administrators inside the system that were more centric to universities, had more of an affiliation to universities than the technical or community colleges. So it really was an interesting tearing apart of the TBR system where, people had to figure out where their allegiances were in this whole context. And, am I a university person, or am I a community and technical college person? Does my work change? Where do I stand in this? What happens to the funding? That was a question that swirled around a lot. It was a lot of identity crisis, I think, for the Board of Regents when you think about what the universities have long meant for the Tennessee Board of Regents. In fact, most people associate TBR more with the universities in a lot of ways than they did the technical or community colleges.
I think you're right. And at some point, there was a tipping point as far as just the raw numbers of the universities used to dominate within the Regent system. Their enrollments were far greater than the two-year schools and the TCATs. And at some point, and I'm sure we could look at a chart and see, but the balance went the other way, and a greater number of students were at sub-baccalaureate and that kind of work. Actually, that's a very good point. And to push that a little further, at some point, I think, from a board perspective, there was maybe not so much more interest, but a greater identity with the TCATs than the community colleges. Did you sense that?
I did. I think it has to do a lot with how the TCATs have been structured and placed out physically. They align with a policymaker's jurisdiction, on the Hill in terms of policymakers. The colleges of applied technology, or the technology centers as they were called, they had a lot more political pull, still do to some extent, than our community colleges had. And when you think about universities with such a strong alumni base, they can definitely have power on the Hill, but not necessarily for community colleges. So the way in which the TCATs have been sort of set up and frameworked out, it made it easier for them to be a lot more prominent at times than community colleges. And on top of that, their outcomes, especially during the CCTA, that was sort of inspiring for a lot of leaders. At one point, the thought was, why can't we just make everything like a TCAT? And we found out that it only applies to a small subset of students and a small subset really of career tracks. But their graduation rates and placement rates gave them a leg up as well against our community colleges.
Yeah, it really was amazing. And I guess it makes sense, but that became the coin of the realm. Completion rates, placement rates, and like you said, why can't others be like the TCATs?
Right.
Yeah. Well, and to the other point about their political base, I mean, there was all this emphasis on continues to be workforce development. And so those are the institutions that can work more successfully with employers and in attracting new industry. So, I mean, it all makes sense.
Long term, I think it creates more of an identity crisis for the community colleges. When I think about the faculty members that I know that were in the applied Associate of Science or the Associate of Arts related programs and courses that identified more with universities because it was more transfer related, or they had their networks were more closely aligned with that versus career programs. I can see it in a lot of the voices I hear and the people I talk with at the community college level, that they're worried that part of the community college is starting to fade away, and it's being more focused on careers and workforce development than a lot of the prestigious aspects that they had around transfer.
Yeah. And again, it's not even irony, but just the observation. when they started, back in the late 50s, early 60s, they were looked at as junior colleges. I mean, the first 2 years of a 4-year of a university degree and how that's evolved, and it makes perfect sense how that has. So let's move now to the third part, using your career path as a transition. So you left the Board of Regents staff which year?
2012. No.
And no.
2016. Sorry.
It was right around the time of the Focus Act, and then you went with this startup organization, Complete Tennessee. So if you could talk about that and where that is.
Sure. It was an opportunity that I'd known about, kind of followed at a distance. Was fortunate to be asked to join the team and help to launch this rocket off the ground, and pretty much a concept paper, but a lot of great leadership and thought behind it. Your guidance and leadership around that, it's important to note, was critical to it. The point of Complete Tennessee is to create this sort of nonprofit, outside of the public sphere entity to do a few things for the state that are important given all the work that we placed around completion and attainment. One, it is a stabilizer in political transitions, where the push for college completion, we could see in the future where policymakers don't have the bandwidth or don't have it in the priorities to make sure that we keep pushing towards greater outcomes for students. So this entity can handle that, where sometimes at the state level it can't be handled. And we definitely will see a test for our organization and for the state coming into November with a new governor. And then definitely we've got the largest wave of state legislators since the Civil War. The hope is that Tennessee doesn't lose momentum and definitely doesn't change directions. Two, it's around being the accountability partner piece. We sometimes consider ourselves to be a watchdog. And we're higher education in a lot of states. They don't have that outside partner to put a lens on things that can apply more so to the average citizen. In Tennessee, we only have around 40.7% of the population that has some college or post-secondary credential. But we want to make sure everyone is informed on how higher ed is performing and how it looks and how it should work. So through reporting and through different types of informational tours, we make sure that everyone is that accountability partner for higher ed to make sure we keep pushing for higher graduation rates and attainment rates. And then lastly, it's about building a network of leaders around higher education. So we bring them together in different ways to make sure that I in Kingsport know some leaders in Memphis and I can learn from their work, and vice versa, they can learn from ours. And through our work, we've been able to create a nice network. We've been able to educate a lot of leaders in this space. I like to say that the things that we say and do have been valued by the state in keeping this push for attainment and college completion going. But ultimately, that's kind of a not so formal way of saying that's what our role has been for the state.
Yeah, well, it really is an experiment. It may be something like it in other states, but I sure don't know about that. But it goes back to that basic question, as you just said, we've been fortunate in Tennessee, two two-term governors back to back who embraced higher education, made it part of the state's agenda, and some tremendous things were done. We didn't even talk about the Drive to 55, but building on the Complete College Tennessee Act. And then what do you do when you can't depend, with all due respect, you can't depend on the next governor, whoever he or she, but in this case he may be, to sustain that momentum,
right,
or at least sustain where it is, and that makes that's why it's so good there is an objective third party, but an advocate to keep all this going and to translate that so that communities can benefit from it.
Right. Right.
So, what are you? I hope you're optimistic about how that's going to continue to work out.
I am optimistic. When we think about our network at Complete Tennessee, it's been 2 years. We're into our third cohort for our Leadership Institute, and so we have tons of individuals. I was just in a meeting earlier today where we saw previous cohort members embracing new cohort members to share that story around college completion, to be okay with pushing and being a little bit more innovative around improving outcomes and closing equity gaps. Also on the policy level, I met with a couple of policy staffers the other day, and the work that we give them has definitely informed their work. So I think in very small and nuanced ways, we've been able to push conversations, set up narratives where the state can keep pushing forward. I mean, it's important to note that Tennessee is that example out there across the nation. Everyone wants to know, how is that being done? You mentioned Governor Haslam's Drive to 55, Governor Bredesen's Complete College Tennessee Act of 2010. That's extremely rare to have two different governors from two different political parties being on the same page. But it's even more rare for a red state, when people look on the outside in the South, to be so innovative and so much in an embrace of outcomes, and even using the word equity. It gives examples to states even like California. There was an article in the LA Times that said conservative Tennessee gives liberal California much to learn about progressive policies. I think that was the title of the headline. So what we're doing as a state, whether we know it or not, it's driving the nation. It's a catalyst for other institutions and other states to start to innovate in policy and practice. So it's a very rare opportunity, and I think our work has been able to elevate that nationally, but definitely we're thinking about what are the next steps we need to do, since we've done so much in higher ed, to really be sort of that example for the nation.
Yeah. Well, and I'd be curious in your reaction to this. The other thing that I always thought, and I think a lot of it was serendipity, which is okay, but how things became aligned. We talked about the funding formula lining up with the policy initiatives, but also financial aid programs, and using financial aid as an incentive, starting with the lottery scholarship, and making it enough of a merit based so that there's some motivation. But then, and forcing kids is not the right way to look at it, but encouraging students to be a full-time student, which up until then it wasn't part of the program. So over a period of time, with a great number of almost generations of people involved, to kind of get it. And I think that's one thing that Tennessee is, people are taking notice of that. And it kind of goes back then to how responsible is the governance structure? How responsible is it for those kind of initiatives, that kind of momentum? And I think it's pretty, and the Board of Regents really was and continues to be the mainstay of that.
Right, and governance is at Complete Tennessee something that we're looking at heavily. How do we inform, educate, engage board members at all levels, whether they're at the Board of Regents or even our locally governed institutions or even the UT system? How do we impart some knowledge, wisdom, and even give them some resource to make sure that they're pushing for the right things? Because sustainability-wise, if they don't embrace it and own it, no matter what our local institutions or local communities will do, they can definitely derail it more so than a policymaker could.
Yeah. Back to an earlier point, and this is kind of gratuitous, but so we were sitting here in Williamson County, Tennessee. I don't know in terms of population where it ranks, but I do know in terms of wealth and per capita income and educational attainment. If you drew one of those scatter plots, with income going up and down and higher education horizontally, Williamson County always is off the page in the upper right-hand corner.
It's an anomaly, yeah.
Then you have the state average, and then 94 counties down here. It just draws the state average. So is that kind of part of, back to Complete Tennessee, is you're sharing between communities, sharing ideas is part of the goal, to not to pull Williamson County down, but pull people up toward the state average?
Yes, pull them up. Well, the way we look at it is, there are some counties where the attainment rate is in the teens. To think that they can get to 55% is not realistic, but their contribution to the overall average may be to get to 30. And so with that conversation, it makes it more realistic for communities to think through, okay, so you're not expecting us to get to 55%, but to 30. Now, what do we do as a community? What do we have in our own backyard that we can use to support students? Who are those citizens that we need to reach out to? What we hear in rural communities is our kids, they go off to college and they never come back. They're going to go to Nashville, or they're going to go to Chattanooga, and they're going to stay because the quality of life there allows them to do some things that they can't do here in our rural community. So how are we going to improve attainment when we are maybe in fact a net exporter of talent for other counties and communities? And the answer is obviously with your adults, we do have some opportunities there. And so let's rethink as a community how we embrace adults that have some college no degree or have never even experienced college before, and how can we support them through the resources you have right here. And quite possibly you can go from the teens in attainment to 30 before you know it. Executive Director of the Tennessee Higher Education Commission, Mike Krause, always mentions the tangible numbers of, a lot of times it's not thousands of students you have to graduate for a county to increase their degree attainment rate. It could be hundreds. It could be as much as 50 that's going to move it a lot. So, we try to make sure that they have a good context, a good hold on what they need to be focused on. And maybe one day they can get to Williamson County's levels, but, we want to be realistic that maybe not.
Yeah. Well, you had a meeting, a conference last week, a convening, where you had your completion communities talking about local initiatives and what they're doing there. And that the point was well taken, that in the more rural communities, you're talking about moving the needle with fewer number of students. And I think that's just an excellent point to make. So there's, So I guess one last thing I want to ask you, and then I'm going to ask you if there's anything I should have asked you. But back to the optimism and where this is going forward. So we're going to have, we're still in the first year, second year of the Focus Act with the different structures. Do you think, I'm not going to ask you whether that was a good decision or a bad decision, but how does that play through your work? Are you feeling, or are you kind of resetting on how to function?
Sure, it makes it a little bit more complicated because you have 6 additional governing structures to think through. And, we mentioned the Tennessee Transfer Pathways. That was one of the biggest fears amongst a lot of community colleges is, yes, where will there be violation? Do we have enough bandwidth and resource to police any violations of that? And so, our worry is, can we make sure in whatever way that we can that everyone's on the same page for college completion and degree attainment as they should be. I feel like they have the possibility of doing a good job, but we have to be realistic that there could be moments just watching other boards out there across the nation that, one may not go in the right direction, and, how do you correct course on that? And the other thing is too, what's going to be the impact overall for that community or that region if things go awry with the university. So it just makes it a little bit more complex, but it is what it is.
Yeah. We'll work within the system. So
yeah.
Now, anything else I should have asked you about?
Probably I want to talk a little bit about the benefits of Promise and Reconnect in terms of the context of higher ed.
Great.
Yeah.
So please do. And again, Tennessee Promise.
Yes,
under the umbrella of Drive to 55, you have the Tennessee Promise, financial. It's more than a financial aid program. Reconnect, one's right for out of Tennessee Promise for kids, young men and women right out of high school. Reconnect is for adults.
Yes, and so there are a lot of great things we can say about those programs that you would see in articles across the nation. The one thing that I want to highlight, being on the inside from an institution and also at the Tennessee Board of Regents, really centers on this. To my knowledge, is the first time that we've allowed outside entities to play a role and give feedback into how higher ed is run. So when we think about nonprofit organizations like the Heirs Foundation, Tennessee Achieves, or even the Middle Tennessee Reconnect community or the other Reconnect communities across the state, this is the very first time I've ever seen where institutions have to closely partner with nonprofits or outside organizations to get the work done. It's starting to force a more outward-facing approach to how higher ed is run. And for me, that's probably the most interesting part of all of it. Obviously, college going rates going up, great. We're starting to see success rates from Tennessee Promise students look better than their peers or previous years. But for me, I think it's about running programs where you're actually getting direct feedback from nonprofit partners, where before it would be very hard for them to get in the door and even say what's going good or what's not going so well.
Yeah, for them to even have an incentive to comment and to be a part of it. So, well, very good point. It's so good that you're doing what you're doing. So, Kenyatta, thanks.
Thank you.
It's been good talking with you.